Welcome back to another episode of the Hall of Sports podcast. And today I have Gary, who's from Shuffle the Pack podcast. And again, it's an interesting one because a bit of rival of my own team, the Bears, but it's always good to be able to talk about the NFC North. And again, with all the news coming out today about some stuff with COVID, it's probably a great time to have you on with the game happening tomorrow, or if it happens. How are you doing today, Gary?
Yeah, I'm good, mate. I'm good. Thanks for having us on, obviously. The game tomorrow could go either way. It might be on, might not be. It's a total coin toss at this point.
Yeah, it's one of those. I guess it just depends on if there's any more positive tests today out of San Francisco. Hopefully, it was just the one and they'll be able to play the game. But because again, it was an interesting matchup on paper anyway, and especially with the two teams played twice last season, and based on kind of some of the injuries, there's a bit of a kind of contention of who would have been favorite going into the game. But again, we'll get to that during the podcast today. Where can people find your podcast before we start?
So you can follow us at Shuffle Pack on Twitter. That's where we're most active. But as far as I actually listen to it, we're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the big podcasts. We're everywhere, but like rats, you can't get away from us.
Yeah, perfect. Just before we start, I just want to encourage everybody to subscribe again. Same thing. We have the podcast is on Anchor, Apple Pod, Spotify, basically anywhere you can find your podcast, it'll be there. So what we'll start off with is just kind of a review of some of the week's games that we saw in this past weekend. I'll start off with kind of the teams from the NFC North, and I think the best place to start is probably the divisional matchup between the Packers and the Vikings. Now, the way I think everybody expected the game to go before the kickoff wasn't really the way it went, because you saw a Packers team that was in joint first alongside the Bears, and a Vikings team that many of their fans, if you look around social media, have been talking about tanking for Trevor Lawrence and kind of trying to get bad enough to get a quarterback. So maybe the Packers did themselves a little bit of a favor in losing that game, so the Vikings don't get a chance to get the top quarterback in this year's draft. But again, you never want to lose a game. So what did you think of the loss from the Packers, 22-28 from the Minnesota Vikings?
If I'm honest, Kieran, I don't particularly want to talk about it. Pretty horrible game. I was working at the time, so I could only sort of catch bits and bobs on Red Zone while I was me phoning that. But we didn't play well enough. It's as simple as that. It's a well established fact that in order to beat Kirk Cousins, you have to make Kirk Cousins play, and we didn't. There's been talk around the NFL Twitter sphere, if you like, that the wind had a big factor, but you should be able to account for wind when you're up against wind every day. It ended up with Kirk Cousins just handing the ball off to Cook time after time after time, and we just had no answer for it whatsoever.
Yeah, look, I think it's the games that I actually looked. The two main games I looked at was obviously the Packers Vikings in the early window, because the Bears were playing the later window, and the games kind of mimicked themselves a little bit, where really there was one main player on offense that you had to account for, which in terms of for the Packers was Dalvin Cook, and I think he ran for over 200 yards. For the Bears, it was Alvin Kamara, and both in the air and on the ground, he was able to torch the defense. So it was very similar for the two teams that are at top of the NFC North. But again, I don't think it was, to a certain extent, it wasn't expected, because you looked at the Vikings team, very young. They've lost a lot of kind of close games, but they have looked that bit inexperienced, and Kirk Cousins has looked pretty bad this season. Back to the Kirk Cousins we all know and love. But again, I think it does come down to the defense as well. You need to be able to pressure him. I think it's the reason the Bears have always had, well, since Matt Nagy's come in, that why they've had a lot of success against the Vikings is because they've been able to pressure Kirk Cousins both up the middle and from the outside. Going to that, and because you were saying Kirk Cousins had a pretty decent game against the Packers, what's the problem, do you think, with the defense, that they weren't able to get enough pressure on Kirk Cousins? Is it to do with the actual outside linebackers? Is it in general the defense just haven't had enough pressures this season? Or is it something else? Was it just a good game by the Minnesota offense? Or has this been kind of a normal thing that you've seen from this defense this season?
I think it's a little bit of everything that you mentioned there. Obviously, injuries haven't helped. I don't want to be pinning everything on the injuries because that's a total cop out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't think we've had the same defensive line 2 games in a row this whole season. Obviously missing David Bakhtiari, he's a massive loss for us. There's nothing really specific. I mean, Twitter had a bit of a meltdown on Monday saying Mike Pettine needs to go, but I mean that's a bit of an overreaction. Maybe he does. I don't know. Maybe he doesn't quite fit in with the way Matt LaFleur wants to build his defenses as well, because obviously defense wins championships, but offense wins games. But no, I don't think there's been one particular place where we're falling down. We don't have enough superstar players on the defense to be able to pin it on that. We just didn't have an answer for Kirk Cousins. I don't think he played particularly well, but in this particular game, we had nothing for him.
Yeah, it's a fair comment where I think the longer the season goes on, and I think this year more than any other, we're seeing a lot more kind of high profile injuries. And you said it yourself with kind of David Bakhtiari. We're kind of touching it when we were kind of previewing some of the games, but there has been a lot of high profile injuries, especially from last weekend. I guess it could be one of those where, and as a Bears fan, I even looked at the Packers last year, and it's always been said that when they've come up against like a really tough team, you've seen where they've struggled. You saw it with when you played San Francisco last season, that while you were great against most teams, once it came up to kind of that high profile defense or in a more of an established offense, you kind of struggled that little bit. And I don't know if it's the same thing with Minnesota, but when they have kind of this running game that they know exactly what they're going to do, they know how to attack you. If you can't stop it, it's going to be a problem. The issue has been for Minnesota, I think, is being able to keep their key players on offense healthy. You saw it last season, Dalvin Cook went down. The season before that, the same thing. So I think them is consistency, and they haven't been able to have that. But again, you still have to look at it as the Packers in that game, I think, should have been able to win. It doesn't help when really the offense seems to be Aaron Rodgers, and then there's not too much around. Like we've mentioned from before, that from the draft that everybody was so shocked that they didn't get more wide receivers, because he's been kind of crying out for more weapons. And then how has that kind of gone around with Packers fans, that that really the management haven't surrounded him with kind of the high class talent, especially when we just had a draft that every analyst out there was saying it was one of the best wide receiver drafts in, I don't know how, probably since what was it, 2016 or 2015, when the likes of Cooper Kupp and all came out. How does that go around with Packers fans? Do they still kind of trust in what management are doing, or do they think, what are they doing when we have a player like Aaron Rodgers towards it's towards the end of his career, he's still producing at an exceptionally high rate?
It's the classic sports fan meltdown, you know what I mean? So like April came and went, and we picked up Jordan Love in the first. We moved up for Jordan Love in the first, and it was like, it's the beginning of the end for Aaron Rodgers. He has no weapons. He has this. He has that and the other. But if you actually look at how Matt LaFleur and the team have been building with so it's not all just Devontae Adams. You know, you have Alan Lazard, MVS, who has gloves made of butter some days, and EQ's come back off injured reserve as well. So there's actually a few weapons out there. They just need another year or so. There's a lot of sort of recency bias where people seem to forget that last year was just Matt LaFleur's first year, and before that we didn't really have a great coach. I think it was Mike McCarthy before that. It wasn't really much. Let's be honest. Like, look at the job he's doing down at Dallas. You know, it's not really Dallas's fault that they're poor. It's more Mike McCarthy's fault. You know, I think it's probably unfair to say that Rodgers has no weapons where they've been. It's maybe like next year, if they're still not producing, then we need to look at getting some weapons in. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess where the talk comes from is when you see what's happening, where you see Devontae Adams scoring pretty much the large majority of the touchdowns, and I guess it's more that Rodgers was kind of outspoken about what was going on around draft time, that he expected kind of more kind of weapons to come in, and it didn't happen. But again, look, quarterbacks are always going to want more and more players around them. Again, it's management have to build out a whole team while also looking after the future. So really when you analyze it as a whole, it does make sense that they didn't just do everything to suit the quarterback. But I guess some fans might get a little bit edgy because they're thinking, how much longer does Aaron have at this level? And if we don't capitalize on how well he's playing, because you look at it this season, he's probably been one of the top 3 quarterbacks in the NFL this season, the way he's played. He's been unbelievable. But again, will that end up with a championship? And that's kind of, I guess, the main focus point that people have. It's the same reason why I guess there was a lot of people, when I was looking at it over the last 2 days for the trade deadline, you saw a lot of fans wanting Will Fuller to be brought in, and it didn't seem like that happened, because I know there was reports that there was kind of disagreements in kind of the front office for Green Bay, whether it was worth it or not. Amongst even yourselves on your podcast, what was your kind of opinion of both even targeting Will Fuller and then eventually not going and signing him?
I mean, Will Fuller would have been a great acquisition, because after Adams, then there's like a bit of a drop-off in skill to Lazard. Then after that, there's a massive drop-off. So Will Fuller would have fitted in really nice as out like WR2 or 3. From what I understand, the Texans wanted more draft capital than we were willing to give for what is effectively because we have to re-sign a lot of big players in the offseason as well. And I don't think there's enough cap space to fit his contract in, especially with the assumed lower cap next year as well. So, I mean, it wouldn't make a huge amount of sense. While it would have been nice, it would have been a short-term square peg in a round hole.
Yeah, it makes sense. And what you say with the cap space is, I was reading somewhere about when the Saints brought in Quan Alexander, that their cap number this season was 270 million when the projected cap next season is 170 million. So they're
going to struggle with that.
Yeah, it's a big thing that obviously GMs have to look at, and it's probably the reason you didn't see too much kind of activity this year, because while before we didn't see much, you started to see a change in kind of what was happening at the trade deadline, probably the last 2 or 3 seasons. But then this year felt very much like kind of 6 or 7 years ago, where really nothing happens at the trade deadline. But again, I'd say a lot to do with that is the uncertainty to come around with the salary cap. It's probably a reason why you'll see before kind of free agency a lot of players signing with their own teams, because they'll realize there's not actually that much money out there because I don't think there's too many teams that have a bunch of cap space. I think it's between 5 to 6, that because you always have those teams that used to have between like 80 and 100 million. You're not going to have that this year. So it's an interesting one to see kind of how teams are built going forward. We could then go to the other 2 games that kind of featured NFC North opponents, which were the Bears against the Saints. Again, like I said, kind of watching it myself, it was very similar to kind of the Packers game, where they needed to stop kind of one player on offense and they weren't able to do it. Drew Brees had an okay game, but it wasn't anything special. I don't think there was many big plays that the defense gave up. But again, for the Bears, the issues, it seems like it's the opposite of the Packers, that the Bears' issues are always on offense and the Packers are always on defense. Really, as a Bears fan, I think we've become accustomed to not having good offenses, so we don't get too kind of worked up over it. But then the issue starts to be, if you can't run the ball, and then then that makes it even harder to pass the ball, especially when you're in a game that really you can win. Like that game against the Saints was very, very winnable. And I think if the offense was even average, I think they probably win that game by 10 points. But the problem is, and we'll kind of go to this, but there were a lot of injuries. I think before the game, you lose Cody Whitehair, you've already lost James Daniels. That's 2 players in your offensive line. I think within the first couple of snaps on offense, they lose their right tackle, and then Jason Spriggs, who used to be with the Green Bay Packers, comes in. I think he makes it through about 5 to 10 plays. He gets injured, and he comes back later in the game, and then turns out he gets COVID after the game, and it's all sort of messed up. I know for this particular game going forward that the Bears have, I think they've lost 4 out of the 5 of their offensive linemen, and they've brought in.
That's a lot to miss.
Yeah, and they brought in, I think one guy was off the street, but the others were all on the practice squad. But they were players that I think they were brought. There was one or two of them that were brought in the draft this year, like really late on 7th round, and they're going to be expected to start at the weekend. So it's going to be a very difficult ask, I think, over the next few weeks for the Bears to kind of notch up victories. But again, when you have, it goes to that point is when you are in a winnable game, the good teams are able to kind of get those wins out and just get over the line. And then we kind of go into the Detroit Lions, who really looked decent enough at the start, and then the Colts came back and beat them 41-21. So looking forward in terms of the division, how do you see kind of the 4 teams, not only kind of this season, but kind of moving forward into next season as well? How do you think that they've done so far?
As far as like the 4 teams go, I mean, the Lions are just the Lions. There's not really a lot you can really say about them. He's got some sort of, like Matt Patricia has some sort of magic that, I worked under Bill Belichick, so I must also be a genius, but that's proven to be quite the opposite. Like me and James on the podcast, we spoke about, Dan Quinn's gone, Bill O'Brien's gone, Adam Gase is probably gone at the end of this year. Is Matt Patricia going to be on that same pile, if he's not, he must have some sort of photos of the owners of the Lions, because there's no other reason for him to still be there, The Vikings, I kind of expected them to make more of a challenge this year. I thought they would have been pushing us for the division rather than the Bears. Obviously, no offense, knowing who this podcast is for. But they lost a few guys in free agency. Obviously, they traded away Yannick Ngakoue after a really weird, so like 5 or 6 games, whatever it was. That just seemed like a strange trade all around. And the Bears themselves, like, it's been a bit of a roller coaster season. Probably the luckiest winning team in the league this year. You've had a lot of games you probably could have lost, like the Lions in week 1, I think it was, when Swift dropped that catch right at the death. Trubisky, not the guy you thought he was when you drafted him against Watson and Mahomes. Nick Foles paid all that money for effectively an old backup, but he's become your guy. Like, I don't know what's going on in the division, to be honest. Like,
yeah, it's a tough one. Like you said, Lions are Lions. I don't expect them to get any better anytime soon. Look, they have good players, but it just seems that they can never put it together. And anytime they look like they're going to do well, they do something to mess it up. And whether it's coaching or whether it's the actual mentality within the players, I don't know. Like you said, Matt Patricia probably should have been fired last season. I think he hasn't really shown anything to kind of prove that he deserves to still be a head coach, because, again, his excuses early on in the season when he was losing late in fourth quarters were he brought up the kind of Malcolm Butler play for the Patriots instead of kind of looking at what's happening now. And that's usually a bad sign when you're talking about your past rather than kind of what you're doing right now. That's a big issue with a coach. Minnesota, again, I don't know if it's just that they have a lot of inexperience and young players that have come in to kind of replace a lot of their older veterans, and that's a big reason why they've dropped off, or is it that the overall talent of the team has kind of diminished? But the problem's going to be, again, I said it kind of during the offseason, was kind of extending Kirk Cousins beyond kind of where they would have been able to get off that contract pretty soon. And look, he's not going to be the quarterback to bring them forward. So that one's an interesting one. I thought they were kind of a hit or miss based on the amount of young players that they were going to have this season. I think the big difference within the division is solely Aaron Rodgers, because when you look at the overall rosters, I don't think there's a huge kind of difference other than the quarterback position. With the Bears, I think by far probably the best defense in the division. The problem, again, like I've said before, it comes down to offensive line and quarterback. I think they probably knew at the start of last season that they made the mistake with Trubisky. But look, I don't think they were in a position to be able to try and fix it. You've seen some of the other quarterbacks that were in the free agency, where you have Cam Newton, who's playing just as bad for New England. You have Andy Dalton, who's out for Cowboys, and really they're the only other.
Did he not die on the field last week or something? He looked dead.
Yeah, he did. And unfortunately, I think for the Bears, they were really the only options that were viable in terms of what they could fit in with their cap. So I think they knew that they needed to get kind of someone that could just kind of steady the ship this year, and then hope maybe if they probably will draft someone in the draft this year, or maybe if they go into free agency again. I don't think they'll go free agency though. I think they're probably sticking with Foles as kind of that veteran, kind of Alex Smith type player, and then try and bring somebody in underneath, which, look, it makes sense. You needed someone that could at least run Matt Nagy's offense. His problem, I think, is the offensive line has been so bad. It's the one thing I think a lot of Bears fans have criticized ownership and criticized the GM Ryan Pace a lot for, is really not investing more in the offensive line. I think before Cody Whitehair's extension, and he deserved it, I think they spent the least amount of money in the offensive line in the entire NFL. And that's a big problem because you see it, the reason they're not able to run the ball is because David Montgomery's getting tackled 3 yards behind the line of scrimmage, and that's a big issue. If you can't run the ball, it makes it harder to pass. And I think that's the big issue that they're going to have this season. I just think their offense isn't going to get much better. Their weapons are fine. I don't think there's been an issue. You have Allen Robinson, who's been good. You have Mooney, who's come in this year, and Miller, who have all produced when they've been given their targets and when the quarterbacks had a bit of time. The problem is, if you have a poor offensive line or defensive line, you're not going to win many games in the NFL. And I think that's the issue that they're having right now. To kind of go off the NFC North, because we'll talk about it a little bit again when we kind of preview the game on Thursday and we preview kind of the games the weekend. Some of the other kind of big ones that we could look at for last week, you had the Bengals coming in against the Titans, which was kind of surprising because while the Bengals have played well, they still have done just enough not to win the game, but they were excellent, I thought, against the Titans, who were a team that personally I thought were playing really, really good football this year and kind of established that they were still a team in the AFC that would get into the playoffs. But it was kind of a down week for the Titans. What did you think when you saw that result?
Yeah, but look, James and I on the podcast, we had the Steelers-Ravens game as our game of the week. And it turned out the Bengals-Titans was very much the game of the week. Joe Burrow, he's looking like a really competent, really comfortable quarterback. He just a few more pieces on his O-line, and he could take them to maybe like a wild card berth, maybe not next year, the year after, perhaps. As far as the defense went, I mean, they managed to hold Derrick Henry to, I think it was 110 yards or thereabouts. So I mean, there's a lot more to the Bengals than perhaps we saw last year. Do you think it's maybe losing Andy Dalton and going for Joe Burrow instead? Do you think that's been the catalyst to change it up?
Yeah, I would say so. Look, I think it's very similar to a lot of teams that the majority of the roster is okay or getting towards kind of more above average. But when your quarterback is playing good football, you always have a chance to win. And I think Joe Burrow has actually he's improved every single game that he's played. I thought he was excellent last week against the Browns, or the week before against the Browns. I thought he was unfortunate not to win that game. I think just Baker Mayfield was able to kind of just about get it over the line for the Browns. But again, I think the Bengals they're a team that you have to look out for because, again, if Joe Burrow can continue what he's doing, they are very similar to the Chargers for me. Because again, I think two rookie quarterbacks, both playing extremely good football. I think more people expected it out of Joe Burrow.
Yeah, you expect it from the number one.
Yeah. But again, I guess the fact that there's quarterbacks coming in each season, you're seeing them make a good kind of impression on the NFL. But look, I think that game was just I think they have improved because of the quarterback. I think what happened for the Bengals is they became a real stale team where you didn't see too much change. They were kind of living off those when they were playing well in kind of the regular season, getting into the playoffs and then losing in the first game with Andy Dalton, AJ Green and the likes. But they needed something different. And it was, I think all their fans would probably say it was worth the losing season last season just to get at least a little bit of hope that things are going to turn around for the Bengals.
Yeah, a lot of people had Andy Dalton as probably the best backup quarterback in the league. But he did when Dak broke his leg. He came in, played really well that game, and then did nothing in the next game, and then obviously got a really bad head injury, and I think he's got COVID now as well. Actually, really bad head injury the following week. Is Andy Dalton just is he just spent now? Like that, too many years in Cincinnati just ruined him. Do you think?
Yeah, I think it's difficult, especially for someone who's so used to being the starter to go and then be a backup. Is kind of hard because the way that you're practicing during the week is completely different, because when you're a backup, you're basically doing nothing. You're kind of watching the first team doing their reps. You're really just on the scout team for the defense, and you're there supporting the kind of the starter. When you see it a lot, that when backups come into a game cold, that they actually play pretty well, because the opposing defense doesn't have the time to kind of game plan for that player coming in. That's why you see a lot of these backups. They come in, have a great game, and then the following week you see kind of the down period, and where they're not able to kind of do as much when they have that full week of prep and the defense has a full week of prep on them. I think that's probably similar to Andy Dalton, where it's harder to be a backup when you're not really the guy week in, week out, taking all the snaps. And there's not many quarterbacks that can do that. Like, you look at kind of some of the successful ones, really, you have Nick Foles was good for when he played for Philadelphia, came in when Carson Wentz got injured, but really there's not a lot of other players that you look at out there that you can say have been successful as backup quarterbacks, because it can be difficult to come in and then try and continue, especially for Dallas, what Dak was doing. Because again, we mentioned how good Aaron Rodgers has been this year, but Dak Prescott was for a team that wasn't playing very well, he was outperforming probably the rest of. Even looked at the offense, and it never looked like some of their weapons were having special games, but Dak Prescott was always he was always in the stat sheet. He was always getting some of these really, really nice plays week in, week out, and then gets that really, really bad injury. And who knows how that affects his kind of future going forward. Do the Dallas Cowboys re-sign him? Do they franchise tag? Or is he one that hits the market? I think that's probably going to be the story of the offseason, because other than that, there's not a whole lot of other players that you look at that's going to be a big kind of storyline around. Last year was obviously the year of the quarterbacks with Brady, kind of coming out of contract. I think this year is really just going to be on Dak, and that's going to be tough because of his injury was a pretty hard one. But again, I think Dalton was in a hard situation, but then really anybody now that's going to be quarterbacking for the Dallas Cowboys, it's going to be very hard to win games, because they've gotten themselves into a hole where does the team start to lose hope? Especially, I guess the only good thing is the division is pretty weak overall, that even if they can put a little bit of a run, they can still make the playoffs. But look, generally when you lose your starting quarterback, you're not going to do much in that season. And I think that's the biggest issue for Dallas right now. Other than the coaching, I've never really been a fan of Mike McCarthy. So
no, me neither.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I know a lot of Packer fans that haven't liked him either. So again, one of the other games that we'll kind of finish up on the previews from last week on is one that you mentioned there, was the Steelers and Ravens. So Steelers, best kind of streak that they've been on in a long time. So
since the 70s or something, was it not?
Yeah, I think it was 72. It mentioned that that they haven't started off 7-0, and then the other thing that kind of goes along with it, because obviously I think their defense has been one of the sole reasons why kind of that's happened. Look, their offense has been good too, but I think it's been just how powerful that defense has been, and they have gone, I think it's 64 games in a row now with a sack, and the record is 69 games from the Tampa Bay team of, I think it's 0-2. So that's a really impressive thing if they can kind of continue that and see how much longer they can kind of go on unbeaten. Like, you look at it, they're 3 games away from basically making the playoffs already, which is a remarkable feat. And it just shows kind of how important Roethlisberger is and how important a quarterback is, because when he goes out, you see a huge dip in how the Steelers have played over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think having last year out because he was injured for the whole year. But was it a shoulder injury? I can't remember. But he was out the
I
whole
think it
time.
was
So
shoulder or back
yeah,
or something last year.
something like that. But so having that year off, he looks like he's 5 years younger. He hasn't taken the hits he would have taken last year. Like the Steelers have got like great weapons. Chase Claypool, rookie guy, come in. It looks brilliant. It looks like he's playing for fun. And looking ahead of their schedule, they look like they're maybe if they lose to the return game, that's the only game I can see them maybe losing. But even then, they've obviously just beaten the Ravens. So I can't. They might go 16-0 this year.
Yeah, which is crazy because when you think about the AFC, everybody talks about the Chiefs because obviously with Pat Mahomes, and then other people talk about the Ravens because of Lamar Jackson. But I feel like even though they're 7-0, people have actually slept a little bit on how good the Steelers have been this season because again, they don't have that kind of, I guess they don't have that sexy name at the quarterback position, that young star, but they've been just as good as the Chiefs. And I guess one of the interesting ones, I always find it that when it comes to playoff time, the AFC playoffs for years was very dull because you knew exactly who was getting in. I think this might be the first season where there's actually a bit of kind of, I guess, competition there where you have three big teams where you still have the Chiefs, obviously, because Mahomes has been excellent. You have the Ravens and the Steelers. And again, if you can find another kind of one more team in there, you're looking at a really good kind of divisional series in there where you're going to have kind of two good matchups there. We've seen that in previous years for like the NFC, but having that in the AFC is excellent. And personally, I think the Steelers are probably the most well-rounded team this season, and it's probably the reason they've gone unbeaten. I don't think that even though their schedule probably looks it, they could go unbeaten. I don't think that they're one of the favorites to get to the Super Bowl because, again, you look at what the Chiefs did last year in the playoffs and they have that much firepower. Do you think the Steelers are a team that can keep up with that if they get put into a high-scoring game, or do they really need that defense to kind of keep those scores down a little bit?
I think their defense is more important than their offense. Like definitely, I said at the top of the recording, like defense wins championships, offense wins games. They could conceivably go 16-0, get right to the championship game, and then get pumped out by the Chiefs quite easily. Like really easy to think that. Yeah, I mean, if they lose one or two key pieces of defense, and the whole shoot match is done. They really need all their players to be healthy for the next, was it 8 games or something like that? Because they had one of their games, I think the Titans game, rescheduled for when so that's maybe that extra, so like half week off if you like. It's probably helped them stay fresh. So it'd be interesting to see how they get on for the rest of the regular season.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it will be a very interesting one. Hopefully, like we said, look, there's been a lot of injuries and stuff happening over the last couple of weeks. It'd be nice to see kind of some of the kind of high-end talent, especially in those teams that you do expect to make the playoffs, that they do stay healthy, because I guess once it hits playoff time, it's always a good kind of 3-4 weeks of football where really you just have the best of the best, which is nice. Well, Red Zone is one of my favorite shows to watch when the Bears aren't playing at 6 o'clock for us anyway, or those kind of early games. It's always a good treat to be able to look at all the different teams and kind of seeing how they're playing. But then again, you get to playoff and it's good game after good game. Really, once you get past that kind of wild card round, sometimes there can be one game that's a bit of a bore because you have a team that's just much better than the other. I guess where we'll move on to is, and we've spoken about it a little bit in terms of the Packers in the NFL trade deadline and just kind of the stories that have come out around the NFL over the last couple of days. Now, where I'll start is kind of about a lot of the injuries that kind of happened last week. So just in terms of for what we'll be talking about next in the Thursday Night Football, you had the likes of Jimmy Garoppolo go out. You had the likes of Tevin Coleman for the 49ers go out. You had Kittle go out. You were mentioning that Bakhtiari's out for the Packers. I think you lost 2 running backs this week? Was it due to COVID as well?
Yeah.
And we've seen, especially this season, there's been a lot of injuries that have been happening. How impactful do you think that's going to be in the weeks moving forward? Because I even mentioned with the Bears losing 4 of their offensive linemen, will it be that the teams that end up making maybe kind of the back end of the playoffs will be the teams that just are able to stay healthy or get people that have been able to avoid, and the problem is to avoid COVID at this point of the season?
It's a difficult one, that, because look, if we look specifically at the 49ers, for example, like the NFC game, the NFC Championship game we played last year, there's not a single member of their offense from that game that are going to be playing on Thursday if the game goes ahead. Yeah. But then you look at how important it is to stay injury free this year, because the team, a lot of the teams have had players opting out for COVID. Like I think the Patriots had 6 players out or something like that, and they're playing absolute trash this year. I don't know if the two things are necessarily related, but it kind of been helping. So you're right enough in what you're saying, that the team that makes it deep into the playoffs is probably going to be the one that's managed to avoid huge swathes of COVID and big injuries and things like that. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see who gets deep in the runs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it could be a big option there for what happened to the Patriots, and I think it was 6 or 7 players opted out. I know as a Bears fan with Eddie Goldman, he opted out from his, and that's taken away from our run defense quite a lot because he was a big part of that. And there were some other teams that have lost kind of similar members, but then we're seeing more and more each week kind of be added to that kind of COVID reserve list. What was it, 2 weeks ago, or was it last week? Maybe it was 2 weeks ago with the Raiders. Their whole offensive line were put on the COVID reserve. And again, I guess it comes to how coaches manage their kind of clubhouse, that you need to be able to be on top of the players, making sure they're doing all the right things with all of the restrictions that the NFL has in place. Because again, one player can ruin it for 6, 7, 8 others, and that can be the difference between winning a game and losing. And that's just one of, I guess, the external factors that teams have to deal with this season. And we expect certain teams to make the playoffs, but you never know. It could hit one of those big games. It could be the AFC or NFC Championship game, and suddenly one of those teams has got 3 or 4 players that test positive for COVID. We've seen there's quite a lot this week in particular, because obviously the news that came out today was that the San Francisco 49ers have actually closed their facility because of a COVID test. And I would assume they're going to take another test today, all the players. And based on that, I would assume whether the game takes place or not. It's one of those really tricky situations for even both teams, because the Packers are due to, I think, leave Green Bay this evening to head to San Francisco. So how do you think the mindset of some of those players could be like, knowing that, really not knowing if you have a game? Because let's say the test results don't come back by the time Green Bay are supposed to travel across the country. How impactful do you think that could be kind of moving forward?
Well, if nothing else, it's a nice day out. You get to go little fly across the country and that. So, but forgive me for name dropping here, but we had Nat Coombs on our podcast earlier in the season, and we spoke about the possibility of when they do get late in the playoffs to Tampa, basically. So you'd have your 2 conference champions in 2 separate bubbles within the city, and then they just go and play the game, and it should, in theory, restrict the possibility of COVID. Obviously, that's not practical for the week-to-week games, but as far as the Packers go, if they get out there and they can't actually play a game, then they just turn around and come home, I suppose. It gives us an extra week to get more of our players a bit of time for health, because we're still missing Alan Lazard. He's a good couple of weeks away, so we're still missing a few key pieces. So it won't hurt us to take that week off.
Yeah, absolutely. I think where it probably has an impact is later on when they're trying to fit on all these games. Like we said, there was one of the Steelers games earlier on got cancelled or postponed. I guess the more and more games that get postponed, kind of the less rest I'd say players get when it gets closer to those playoff games, which is important. But again, it could be that you get to that point and you're already in the playoffs with the extended playoffs this year. So it might be even another game that you can kind of rest some of your players if it's put in. Let's say if it was cancelled, and I'd assume it would just be put in at the end of the season. Like I think one of the Pittsburgh games was supposed to be then, and they'll probably just do that kind of extra week. But again, I don't think anything really is finalized too much with some of these kind of refixtures. Because I know we lost a couple of games early on. There was that kind of 2 or 3 week period where there was about 3 or 4 games that they weren't sure when they were going to put them on.
Yeah, there's a sort of period when it was like the Titans had 2 weeks and then the Patriots had the following 2 weeks kind of thing. There's a lot of rejigging.
Yeah. I know it's got to be tough, and I know that there was a lot of talk from the NFL that any team that was not kind of abiding by kind of some of the procedures that the NFL put in place would be, I think they were said that they would be sanctioned in some way. So I think that's another thing that teams have to watch out for, and the NFL will be questioning kind of why certain teams will get these COVID these positive tests. Now I think it's different if it's one player got it from somewhere and then there was a couple of close contacts, but I think the teams that if it comes to a point where a team has suddenly got 15, 16 players to have it, there will be kind of more kind of, I guess, not so much investigation, but the NFL will be looking into it to see how this happened. Were they following the procedures that were put in place? It's a really tricky year for that, I think. But again, I guess all we can do as fans is kind of look forward to the game. So while we have it, most of us from different countries are probably going back into lockdown. So having more sports on the TV is
it's not a bad thing. Yeah, I mean, like looking specifically at Green Bay, there obviously we've had a couple of players, drop out this week from COVID. But Brown County, where the Green Bay itself is located, has been one of the worst affected by COVID in the last few months. And to only have 2 or 3 cases in the whole team, it says quite a lot about the organization, I think. I don't know if it's overprotective and overbearing, you must do this from the management to the players, or if it's just trusting the players to do the right thing and to behave so they can keep doing their job, basically.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I remember listening to a podcast of, I think there was 2 reporters for the Bears that would do it, and they had people on, one of the staff members that was basically in control of kind of COVID, and they were saying all these different procedures that they had put in place. And even the fact that I think the relatives of all the players were getting tested at the kind of the same times that the players were, just to make sure. Because you look at, especially in the NFL, you look at some of these teams and they're in these big populated cities where there has been a lot of COVID tests, especially early on in the season where the US really weren't past that first wave. They were, and it just kind of has gotten worse over the past couple of weeks. So especially when you look at the likes of any of the teams down in Florida, where you would think of Jacksonville or Miami, where really from the start of the season, the numbers of COVID tests were already very high in those areas. And for them not to lose a lot of players, I guess it shows that whatever protocols the NFL have put in place has actually worked to a certain extent, because it's a very difficult task, because it's not like the NBA or NHL or MLB that were in a bubble. They haven't been able to do that, and still to keep it quite low is, I guess it's very good, considering in the off season we were probably hearing more big profile stories of players getting COVID. You had Von Miller that got it, you got Ezekiel Elliott, and really you haven't heard of too many of those big name players be missing a game because they've tested positive for COVID. And I guess all the teams need to be kind of rewarded for what they've done there. Let's think of the actual game on Thursday. We've mentioned kind of whether it might happen or if it doesn't. How would you see the game going? Especially you have the injuries to the 49ers, which are key. So you now have Nick Mullins coming in instead of Jimmy Garoppolo. You have Kittle that's not going to be available for the game. I think Adam Schefter reported yesterday that Tevin Coleman's out of the game. How do you see it going, especially considering last season the 2 games that the Packers and 49ers played were fairly one-sided, but like you said, I think it's pretty much every player on the offense for 49ers wouldn't be playing this week. So how would you see that game going if it goes ahead?
Well, considering that the 49ers are basically held together with string and sellotape at this stage, we should really beat them. It probably will be fairly piecemeal because there's injuries on both sides. Obviously, more injuries for the 49ers, but I don't think one team will dominate too much. I think it's probably going to work in Kyle Shanahan's favor that Jimmy G can't play because I don't really think he rates him very much. But obviously, the other side of that, the run game for the 49ers is most of it still out. I think Kittle's obviously out for the rest of the regular season, and nobody else really stands out. Maybe Ayuk. They don't really
he's
have
had a good start to the season.
I think a lot of the good stuff for Ayuk has been bigged up by that one play where he hurdled the other guy.
Yeah.
So highlight reel now. But apart from that, there's no one really standing out for me on the 49ers team, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we'll just run roughshod over them. Because if you look at the game we lost against the Vikings, we didn't play particularly well. When we played against the Buccaneers and we lost that game again, we didn't play particularly well. It's like sometimes something gets in the head of maybe Matt LaFleur or the coordinators or something. But I don't know. We're coming off the back of a loss. Aaron Rodgers historically plays better with a chip on his shoulder, so we should probably win. I would imagine. I hope.
Yeah, it's an interesting game because even without those players that we mentioned on offense, you still have to look at that defense for San Francisco, and you still have to worry about Nick Bosa, who probably, even though he wasn't given kind of all the plaudits, stat, he was probably one of their best players last season. You looked at the Super Bowl, and apart from Pat Mahomes, he was probably the best player on the field. Again,
Nick Bosa was out for the season.
Is he out for the season?
Did he not do his ligaments in the Jets or Giants game earlier in the season? I could be wrong.
Oh, well, that changed a lot. I didn't even hear about that one. Yeah,
because that week when there was like 7 ACLs snapping across the league.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
I think he was one of them.
I completely.
I'm right. Can you do me a favor and write that down so I can tell my wife? That'll be all right.
Yeah. I guess that shows that just how many injuries that there actually has been, because a lot of these teams, and you look at the 49ers, they've been riddled with it all season now, that for them to even kind of be able to, I think they're at 4-4 right now.
Yeah, 4-4.
That for them to even kind of get to that point, and even if they're able to, whether it's this week, next week, the week after, get some wins together, that's very impressive for a team that has suffered a lot of injuries. It's been something around the 49ers as well. Last year, very fortunate, didn't have too many injuries. The year before, they got destroyed with injuries, and I think that year
Jimmy G went down again.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a big issue for them. You mentioned Shanahan not really liking Jimmy G, but I think one of the big issues as well is he seems to get injured quite a lot. I think this is the second time this season he's missed time.
With the same injury as well, it was a high ankle strain or sprain against the Dolphins. They maybe rushed him back a little bit too soon last week.
Yeah, exactly. And look, that's an issue, but I guess it's hard when, if your quarterback feels like he's ready, you feel like you probably need him, because the first game that Mullins played when he came on for Jimmy G, he was excellent, but then the week after he didn't really do that much, and it's one of those that they probably felt like they needed to try and push him back in to see if he was ready, and I'd say they're regretting it now because they have a couple big games coming up that they kind of need to start getting some of those wins. Like you said, personally, I think the Packers should win on Thursday night, because you look at who the best player is on the field, and it's going to be Aaron Rodgers. If the 49ers are able to put pressure on him, and if they're able to kind of limit the Packers offense, I think that's where you'll see kind of an important matchup, because it's for the two games that we've seen so far, we've seen with the Vikings and the Buccaneers, is that they were able to kind of fight up against the offense, and then that put the defense under a lot more pressure. And I think that's one way that any team, if they're going to play the Packers this year, you have to put the pressure on the defense. And I think that's the key going forward anyway. In terms of that game, is there anything else that you think about in that game that maybe the Packers will need to watch out for when it comes to the 49ers?
Yeah, we have to try and stop the run. I mean, we showed it against the Vikings. We have no run defense at all. And in fact, the NFC game last year against the Vikings as well, it was the exact same game, basically. We have nothing to stop the run at the moment. Spoke about it earlier that we have some fairly major defensive parts out as well, so that's not helped us in the slightest. Yeah, if the 49ers can put a bit of a run together, then we'll be on our ass. It'd be rubbish. It'd be a terrible game.
So before we go into preview the games of the weekend, I have a couple of friends that are Packers fans, and they always seem to be kind of week to week on how they're feeling about the team. How do you think the majority of Packers fans are actually feeling going forward? Like, how good do you think the team is? Are they good enough to have a deep playoff run, or do you think it's going to be one of those where they make the playoffs but just not have the quality there to actually get to the Super Bowl or even to the NFC Championship game?
No, I think we have enough about us that we can get to at the very least, the NFC Championship game. We might get to the Super Bowl. It depends on which side of the ball the Seahawks turn up on. Because I think the NFC will be between the Seahawks and the Packers. The Seahawks have got basically no secondary, no defense to speak of, but they also have Russell Wilson, DK Metcalf.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So, it depends which one of them turns up. DK Metcalf has his off games, and hopefully, if it comes to it and the games match up, then he has an off game against the Packers, and we can get to the Super Bowl and hopefully win it. As far as the rest of the sort of Packers Twitter sphere goes, it ranges from like extreme ecstaticness to borderline suicidal, depending on what's happened the previous couple of days.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I follow a couple people that are fans of the Packers. It's normally the ones that are more kind of even keeled and will be able to kind of analyze what's happening. There's a couple of guys that follow it that they're crazy. That I think there's one guy that even gets pretty much mocked by some of the players with some of his takes that come out.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. So again, I guess every team has those people, but it's an interesting one. I think for me, when I look at that going forward, I think Packers offense should be good enough. You have Aaron Rodgers there. I don't know how long David Bakhtiari is out. Is he out for the season?
He's out for the season, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a tough one to come back from as well, especially if you do get some of those kind of big defenses that do kind of come at you as players start to tire and get injured a little bit more and get those niggles before the playoffs. It's a kind of an important one to look at, and then obviously the defense, because that's one where, especially when you mention the likes of Russell Wilson, if he can see kind of a weakness in the defense, he's one of those quarterbacks that can kind of make you pay. And it's something that we saw against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, that it got to the point where Brady was having such a good game and the Packers just didn't have enough to kind of come back, where you saw both teams pretty much pull their starters in the end of the fourth quarter. So it's one of those, I think defense probably needs to improve, and it kind of goes with what people were saying about Mike Pettin this week, where the amount of people I saw on Twitter saying that he shouldn't be the defensive coordinator now. The main reason why I found out about that was because during the Bears game, I'm not a big fan of Chuck Pagano. I don't think he's that good of a defensive coordinator. And I think I put it out there saying, is there a worse defensive coordinator on a good team? And then the amount of responses I got for Mike Pettin was ridiculous.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the standard of coaching for the defense, maybe they're kind of on even keels. But again, I think that's where the Bears are that little bit ahead of other teams in terms of that defense. But again, they're never going to be, for me, even if the Bears had a good record and made the playoffs, which they could, it's still not going to be real until kind of you get that offense going, because you have to have good quarterback play to win in the NFL and to do well in the playoffs anyway. So I think for the Bears, it's kind of, they have to build on what their defense does this year, and they're going to need to they have to really pick a lane next year. They have to either completely rebuild the offensive line, or they need to get a different quarterback, even if it's someone in the draft to come in where you have that plan going forward. That's the only way I think they can rebuild it. The Packers are, on the other hand, I'd say it's the defensive side. Like you said, having all the changes in the D-line is never good. So I guess trying to kind of, whether it's you're having to replace players that have been in and out, or if you just need to get more depth there so that you don't see that big drop off. I think those are the two areas that the two teams at the top of the NFC North need to work on. The Vikings, they're interesting. Like I said, they've so many young players. There's so many young players they've traded away. Like we saw Diggs got traded away in the offseason. You saw Ngakoue get traded away. There was rumors of a lot of teams inquiring about Adam Thielen. So it'd be interesting to see what the Vikings do when it hits the offseason. There was those reports that there was a lot of their veteran players that were asking for a trade. Will that come back up in the offseason? So it could be to where we start 2021 where really you have the Packers and the Bears, and it's hard to trust in the Lions with the way they're built right now. But again, I think it's those two things where the Packers and the Bears are opposites of each other. One needs to improve the defense, one badly needs to improve the offense. And
I mean,
I think the way it goes forward is with the Packers, like we mentioned earlier, you win games with to see the Packers, I think, in the regular season be able to notch up just that many more wins than the Bears.
I mean, it's not like the Packers defense is completely like shot to bits. Obviously Bakhtiari is out, but obviously we've still got Zadarius Smith, Rashad Gary still there. We picked up Chris Barnes out of free agency at one point, so there's we're not completely devoid of players, but you don't really get D-line superstars. But David Bakhtiari is the D-line superstar of the Packers, and he's just not there for this season. I think that's been a huge loss for us on the D side of things. But apart from that, we're just not playing well either. That's more of it.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to. You see, often it happens though when you have a team that does so well in one season, it's hard to kind of continue that momentum. Usually, the good teams are the ones that are able to build over that year after year, but you don't see many teams able to actually do that successfully. That's why I think when you look at the likes of the Seattle Seahawks, they haven't had the best talent the whole time. But because they have Russell Wilson and they've had kind of corner piece players in that team, they've kind of been able to continue on kind of each run. And while they weren't always favorites to get to the Super Bowl, you've looked at them for the past kind of, I'd say, 8-9 years. They've always been one of the favorites in the NFC to kind of make the playoffs. And they've been in a tough division the whole time as well. You've had the Rams when they were really good. You had the 49ers the last couple of years, the 49ers when there was kind of Jim Harbaugh was there. You even had the Cardinals one of those years with Bruce Arians, and you still saw the Seahawks be there. So I think they're one of the teams that a lot of other teams have tried to emulate from when they were really good. And it's one that's, I think it's difficult for a lot of teams to do, especially really from next year with the salary cap going down by about 100 million. That's going to be really interesting to see how much change there will be with different teams. I'd say there'll be a lot of restructures in contracts anyway. Yeah. So to kind of finish up on today, we'll just go through some of the kind of key matchups in at the weekend, just kind of ones that we picked out. So the first one that I looked at that seems like a really juicy matchup was the Colts and the Ravens, two teams that have been heavy hitting teams, and really you look at it, two very strong defenses. Probably Colts defensive line is one of the best in the NFL. You look at the Ravens, the pass rush has been great. They've been decent in kind of when they've been kind of covering receivers. And it's been an overall good defense for the Ravens. And you look at the two offenses, you look at the Colts, they've mainly been more of kind of that running attack and be balanced. They're never going to kind of score too many points, but and you'd be able to kind of come back, while the Ravens are that team that if you give them that little bit of space, they can score 30, 40 points on you. How would you see that game going? Because look, when you look at them, that's probably one of the biggest matchups this week.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've got Ravens to win written down. Like Rivers, he's looking better than he did in the last couple of years at the Chargers. I think taking all 900 of his kids across to Florida and then him going to Indianapolis is done him a power of good. The Ravens still have an exciting offense, which I probably think is better than the Colts defense. Obviously, they've got a strong defense as well, like you mentioned, and they've got the Lamar factor as well, which you can't ignore. If you stop Lamar, you stop the Ravens, but I can't see the Colts doing that.
Yeah, it's very difficult. You've seen it's a weird one because you see it in the playoffs, and suddenly teams are honing in on Lamar Jackson, are able to stop him, but then no matter what, when it gets to the regular season, he's back to playing where he was last season in the regular season. And it's a weird one because you would expect that after a certain amount of time that people would know how to defend him, but he's just been that electric as at the quarterback. He's that kind of difference maker at the quarterback position without being the best passer of the ball. Because you really have to defend his feet as well. It's kind of difficult to know what to do against the Ravens. And look, they have a balanced attack as well. Their offensive line is good. They can run on you if they have to, and also they can pass on you. So they're one of the toughest teams to beat in the NFL right now, and it kind of just gives more props to what the Steelers were able to do last week. The second game, and just because we've been talking about the NFC North, it's probably not a game that a lot of people are going to be really tuning into. I don't think unless it's on Red Zone. I probably won't be either. But
it probably won't be on Red Zone either. It's just going to be that bad.
I know. So the Vikings against the Lions.
I've got this down for a tie. I can't see either one of them trying to win.
Yeah, it's a weird one because if you were a fan of either the Vikings or the Lions, and you are where you are now, would you prefer your team to just pack it in at this point and try avoid long-term injuries and kind of set yourself up going forward, or do you want to start building up some of those wins? Because look, you look at both teams and they're still in a position to get a really high pick in the draft, which, like we said, with the salary cap coming down, could be even more valuable than it's been in previous seasons.
If I was a fan of either one of those teams, I would probably be wanting them to sort of scale the season back, go for the high draft pick because they're not going to win the division. They're not going to make a playoff charge. So take the rebuild. You know what I mean? Get rid of Matt Patricia if you're a Lions fan. Get rid of Kirk Cousins if you're a Vikings fan. Then hopefully get some like a half decent draft number. Maybe not tank the season completely because it's like after sort of like the first 5 or 6 players, there's not really a lot out there yet that I can see. But yeah, you'd probably take the loss for the season, take the rebuild.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think both teams, if you're kind of tanking at all, you're looking at probably Trevor Lawrence or Justin Fields. They're the kind of 2 quarterback names. But look, I think the problem for the draft this year is going to be there's going to be other players that haven't played this year because of COVID and may fall in the draft because there hasn't been that many people to be able to watch them because look, we don't know when this is going to end. It could go all the way into the combine next year where it's all basically done online, where there's really maybe a scout for each team, and that can be a little bit difficult. So it could be a reason why some good players will probably drop down. So really getting into that top 10 is probably important because they're going to be the kind of absolute players that you're sure of that are going to be very, very good. Especially if you're looking at the quarterback position. You have so many teams now that had players that they thought were going to be the answer. You even have to look at the Jets with Sam Darnold this year. He's been terrible. And really, even though he's injured, you have to think, is it more of that they're trying to hold back because the Jets are in a prime position to get Trevor Lawrence if they keep losing. So I wonder if they try and it would make sense for the Jets to try and do that anyway.
I wonder if Trevor Lawrence does another year at college instead of going to New York.
That's very interesting to see where he goes because it's a good point though, because the fact that he's lost out on basically a normal year of college football, does he want to do that? Because he's probably got to the point of his name is so high in NFL circles now that regardless if he went out this year or the following year, that he'd still be drafted very high. I guess it's hard when you're basically being guaranteed the number 1 pick and the money and the kind of the long-term kind of stability. I guess the only thing is it's the Jets. So do you want to stay back?
It could depend on how he comes back from his COVID, because I think he's out just now with COVID. Is it Clemson he plays for? So they're he's not playing for them last week and this week, which I think is against Notre Dame. So he might have like a Cam Newton situation where he gets COVID and then just can't seem to pick the ball up properly anymore.
Yeah, it's an interesting one and I guess it all goes to it that does he want that kind of last year of kind of normality in a college football season, or does he want to end it the way he is now? You can say that for even a lot of the quarterbacks. You have Justin Fields for Ohio State. Now, I think he'll probably go because, look, Ohio State always have quarterbacks coming up after, and really that's kind of like a production line that when you're ready, you go. You have Trey Lance from, I think it's North Dakota State, he only played in 1 or 2 games this year after having an exceptional. I think he beat Carson Wentz's records there last season and looked as kind of a sure-on kind of top 10 pick, but now is kind of pushed back a little bit. But again, that comes to the fact that he's only played a game or 2 this year, and I don't think it was as good as people expected. But I think this draft is going to be very, very interesting. We then go to kind of I think it's going to be a quite tight matchup between the Bears and the Titans. I can't see loads and loads of points scored. You'll see the Titans try and run the ball, and I think they'll be able to do it quite successfully. The Bears' run defense has been the kind of Achilles heel for their defense overall. I think pass defense has been good. Their rush has been good. But I think for the Bears, it's all going to come down to stopping Derrick Henry. Again, I think this is just a really bad matchup for the Bears this week because Titans have a really good defense as well. Bears just, like I said, when you're losing 4 offensive linemen for 1 game, I don't think anybody can really pick you to win that particular game.
No, definitely not. If Matt Nagy is smart, then he probably looks at what Cincinnati did last week and just straight up repeat it. The Chicago defense is much better than the Bengals one, obviously, and they managed to stop the Titans. It didn't really look under too much pressure. To the point where Joe Burrow managed to put up, was it 31 points or something against to 20 for the Titans? So it's definitely possible to stop Derrick Henry. You just need to find out what Cincy did and just repeat it. I think. Yeah,
I guess it's easier said than done. I guess Cincy did an excellent job last week. If they can show that kind of blueprint for a lot of teams, say there'll be a lot of teams in the AFC, they'll be very thankful going into the playoffs that they'll be able, if they're able to neutralize him. The next one that I kind of wrote down was the Chiefs and the Panthers, because the Panthers have been one of those kind of up and down teams that some weeks you see Teddy Bridgewater in that offense and it's been excellent, and then other weeks they don't really do anything. The game that they played against the Bears, I wasn't impressed with their offense at all. It didn't look like when Teddy was put under pressure, he didn't look like the quarterback that we've seen him as, that kind of accurate quarterback we've seen this year. He hasn't taken too many risks, but he's been able to kind of drive them up and down the field. The Chiefs are the Chiefs. They're a high-powered offense. The defense has been fine as well. But again, Patrick Mahomes has been on, again, kind of his level this year. It's just been crazy. Like we've mentioned Rodgers, we've mentioned Dak, we've mentioned Wilson. You have to mention Mahomes and kind of that same elite company this season as well.
Yeah, I mean, Carolina, they've looked about as average as you thought they would be with like a first-year quarterback, and obviously losing McCaffrey for, was it 4 or 5 games, whatever it was? But Mike Davis is coming out and just like the Panthers are barely blinked, so they've not really been special, but I don't think anyone expected them to be. Chiefs will most likely win, but the Panthers could give them a bit of a scare like the Raiders did. Yeah,
absolutely. I think the Panthers are one that people didn't expect to be that good, but then look, with the new head coach coming in, I think they've done a lot better than that. They've made themselves a bit more respectable, and even a team that if they get a decent draft pick, because I don't think they're going to have a hugely impressive record this year that's going to push them out of the top 15 or 16. If they can build on that, especially on offense, because look, if you're able to stop McCaffrey, and then really their wide receivers, they're good once they catch the ball because they're hard to take down in space. But the problem is those contested catches, you don't see them coming up with too many of them, and that's kind of their main issue. The next one, which is a very interesting game, is the Bills and the Seahawks. We've mentioned enough about the Seahawks, but then to go on the AFC side with the Bills, they've been very strong defensively. How do you see this game going? Because these are kind of 2 teams that you would almost have guaranteed to be making the playoffs.
I think the Bills get a lot of credit because the Pats are so bad this year. It's kind of making them look better than what they actually are. They started the season really well, but since then, Josh Allen the last couple of weeks has looked like he doesn't want to let go of the ball, doesn't want to run, doesn't want to do anything. Just he's gone a bit sort of Joe Flacco-esque. He hasn't maybe given up like 31 yards for a third, but he's getting that way. Seahawks will probably win by a cricket score, I think. I think it'll be a massive, massive run.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to go against the Seahawks the way Wilson and DK Metcalf are playing. I still can't believe that Metcalf lasted as long as he did in that draft, because he's been one of the better wide receivers that came in not this past draft, but the one before.
Yeah,
he's been excellent. The next game I think is a really interesting one, because you have the Las Vegas Raiders playing really, really good football. But then you also have Justin Herbert for the Chargers playing really good offensive football, but they just haven't been to that level to be able to sustain it for the full game and to get away with the win. This is one of those games, I think, where you could see a very high scoring affair between the two teams. How have you been impressed about the Chargers and the Raiders this year?
I've definitely been impressed with the Chargers. Like Herbert, when he came in really weird circumstances, he's not missed a step. He's been a bit sort of quite similar to Joe Burrow in that respect, where he's just sort of like turned up. Okay, this is my job. I'm going to get it done. He's been let down by some of the weapons he has and the D a little bit, but he gave the Chiefs a scare as well. I think he plays a lot like Josh Allen, but not quite as scared of himself. But that being said, I do think Derek Carr has the experience, the edge. He's got slightly better weapons in Josh Jacobs, especially, and for me, it's a Raiders win.
Yeah, I completely agree with that one. To kind of go over the last two games I've written down here now, one, it's tricky because I think it's going to be a good game because you're seeing some of the players come back. For even the Saints with Michael Thomas is supposed to be back for that game against Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which again, they've activated Antonio Brown. Obviously, it's someone that Tom Brady wanted because he wanted him with the Patriots last season, and now he's got his choice in for Tampa. I wonder how long that's going to last, because it seems like Antonio Brown's shelf life has been about 2 weeks and then he's gone. But that'll be an interesting game. I think it's going to be fairly high scoring. Again, I still think that the Bucs are able to kind of come out on top here. What I saw last week with the Saints, even with Michael Thomas back, they have a lot of flaws where you don't see them really stretch the field that much. If the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I know they've lost a few players in that defensive line, but if they're able to put pressure on Drew Brees, I think it could be a fairly straightforward win for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week. What do you think for that game?
I think it depends on which Antonio Brown the Buccaneers have signed. Have they signed the Steelers era Antonio Brown, or have they signed the foot freezing, balloon arriving Antonio Brown? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If even Bill Belichick can't control him for more than a week at a time, then it says a lot about the guy's character. You know, he's obviously still got his court case hanging over him as well.
Yeah.
So it's that you don't know if that's going to play into his head or not. But I mean, given how arrogant he appears to be, I wouldn't worry too much about that if I was a Bucs fan. That being said, Tom Brady has put a lot of faith in him. He spoke about him very highly since his cameo at the Patriots. So you never know. It just depends on which Antonio Brown turns up, I think. But probably Bucs win, to be honest. They're looking very good this season.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last one I've put down is it's mainly just because they're two younger teams that we've seen some good performances from. It won't be one of the first ones that you kind of be putting on the TV, but you look at the Cardinals and the Dolphins, and I don't think a lot was expected of the Dolphins this season, even though they brought in some very good young players last week. But they've been one team that you can look at that have been slowly improving from last year to this year. You look at the Cardinals, they've been up and down. They had a really good season last season when they weren't expected to do that much. Obviously, when you had the first overall pick and it's a quarterback, it's you would expect to kind of improve. But they've been one that I think some people would have expected them to be that little bit better. I think they've lost to the Lions this year. Yeah. What do you see for when it comes to these two teams? For me, like I said, I see two kind of young, vibrant teams kind of on the up and not ready to challenge, but probably over the next 3 to 5 seasons, you'll probably see these two teams being close to the top of their divisions.
Yeah, no, I mean you've hit the nail on the head there. Like when you sent me the games to sort of look over, like this one was easily the hardest one to call, I think. Dolphins didn't play particularly well against the Rams last week, but the defense got it done for them with I think it was 2 defensive touchdowns. This is probably a more fair game to see how well Tua is going to play in Brian Flores' his offense the next couple of years. But they spent a long time tanking for Tua. Basically, they got their man, and now they're running with him. The other side of it, though, is the Cardinals. They absolutely stole DeAndre Hopkins from the Texans. Sorry, and what's his name? Kyler Murray he's like hypermobile. He runs about like a little rat. I mean, he's impossible to catch, and he's got a cannon for an arm. It's probably a card Dolphins could still potentially sneak it. It's a really hard to catch.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I often feel bad for the Texans because you've all these when these new people come in to have to take over. Really, what Bill O'Brien left them is crazy. They have a huge rebuilding project to do there with basically no draft picks.
Well, Miami's got them.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's probably one of the reasons why I'm so down on the Texans. I feel really it's a penny for Deshaun Watson's thoughts right now. I bet he wishes he was in a different situation.
I reckon if he'd hang back on signing that massive contract for like another 6 months, he could have got somewhere else much better.
Yeah, I think I wonder would he even let go of some of that money to go somewhere where even if it wasn't such a crap situation that he's in right now, because you can't really see the Texans getting much better over the next couple of years because they just don't have the draft capital. And like we've mentioned a couple of times with the salary cap going down, it's not really going to be a year for teams to be able to invest in kind of high profile players. So really you're not going to see a huge difference in kind of roster turnover like you normally do from one season to the next, or in terms of kind of big high profile signings. So I think it's going to be a tricky one for them to get out of, and it must be difficult to be a Texans fan right now anyway.
I think it's maybe a bit of a poison shell. It's like you've still got Deshaun Watson and is it JJ or TJ Watt in the line?
Yeah, JJ Watt.
But at the same time, you've got rid of Bill O'Brien, so it's a 50-50 thing there, I think.
Yeah, that's true. At least you got rid of your biggest issue.
Yeah, I mean, how do you think that meeting went down? Do you think General Manager Bill O'Brien fired Head Coach Bill O'Brien, or do you think Head Coach Bill O'Brien handed his notice into General Manager Bill O'Brien?
I bet you Head Coach Bill O'Brien wishes he could fire General Manager Bill O'Brien. I think every Texans fan, you knew so early on that wasn't going to work. He was a fine coach. He wasn't the best, but he wasn't the worst. But general manager speak, he was terrible. And you saw from
general manager.
Yeah, you saw from some of his early trades, even some of the kind of the capital they were giving up, and then even some of the picks that they were making under Bill O'Brien, they were getting progressively worse every single season. And I'm shocked that ownership didn't fire him even for thinking of that trade for DeAndre Hopkins. That's, to me, it makes absolutely no sense what happened in the summer.
No, that's a sackable offense straight away. That's gross misconduct, I think.
Yeah, which I think is crazy considering you listen about different trade talks and it generally has to get approved by ownership. How an owner can even allow something, especially when he's like one of your biggest assets in DeAndre Hopkins, to leave is beyond me. Like, from as far as I know, there wasn't big issues with him in the locker room. He was just a kind of a normal player. He wasn't kind of outspoken against the organization. So it was a really awkward one when you see him leave for so little. And really your biggest piece to get back is David Johnson as a running back, which is in a when his value or his price is way over what you would want to be paying for your starting running back in the NFL these days.
Yeah, it's a strange one. I'm pretty sure a lot of Texans are glad to see the back of him.
Yeah, absolutely. Like a few Texans fans that I'd follow as well, and they were bemused to what happened. I think everybody was joking about can we sign Deshaun Watson for a 6th round pick because of how bad Bill O'Brien was at that time. And if he stayed on, I wonder how long it would have been before he actually made a stupid trade and traded their quarterback.
But he made a stupid trade in Hopkins alone, plus that's beside everything else he did.
Yeah, I don't know. It's crazy. It's one of the topics I think I could be talking for a while on, because
Yeah,
it's funny to think about Bill O'Brien and kind of how he turned a franchise that, after drafting Deshaun Watson, everybody was so high on, now is kind of one of the bottom feeders in the NFL. But yeah, just it's been a great show today, getting to talk to you about this, getting kind of your insight on the Packers from kind of a fan's perspective is always good. Because we get a lot of kind of Vikings fans, we get Bears fans talking about it, but I haven't got a chance to talk to too many Packers fans recently, so it's really good to have you on.
thanks for
Hope
having
you
me on.
enjoyed it, and again, let people know where they can follow your podcast, where they can follow you, maybe on Twitter or Instagram.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to try and pronounce my Twitter handle personally, because it came from like a really bad joke on a separate podcast, and it's just kind of grown arms and legs, and I'm a little bit out of control of it by this point. But the podcast itself is at ShufflePack on Twitter. We talk mostly about, obviously, the Packers, but we generally talk about the wider NFL as well, and we try not to swear, but we can't always guarantee it.
Yeah, I don't think we can ever guarantee it, can we?
No.
Anyway,
Just to jump in there, I've just had a text message from a mate of mine. Matt Staff has been put on the COVID list.
oh my God! Well, then that just makes the
Breaking
Lions even
news.
worse. It should just that should just make like we said earlier, the Lions should basically just tank at this point.
Who is the backup quarterback for the Lions? I couldn't even pick him out of the police lineup.
I don't know. I know they had two last year, but I'm pretty sure one of them went to Denver. I don't know who the. Oh, I actually do know. It's Chase Daniel. He used to be with the Bears. Yeah. So he beat Minnesota last year, so maybe they'll have a better chance of beating them this year.
Fingers crossed for them, eh?
Yeah, that's tough on the Lions. But again, good breaking news at the end of the show today.
So always on the pulse on this show, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining me today, Gary.
Thanks very much, Kieran.